We're showing you how Canada found new buyers for everything Trump threatened to block, why American farmers are losing billions while Trump claims victory, and what happens when you turn food into a geopolitical weapon without understanding who actually holds the power. The dairy lie that started it all. Let's start with the lie that's been repeated so many times it's almost become accepted fact, that Canada charges 250% tariffs on American dairy products, crippling U.S. farmers and creating massive unfairness. Here's what Trump never mentions. Those tariffs only apply if U.S. exports exceed a predetermined quota. And as the U.S. quote, dairy industry itself acknowledges, America isn't even close to hitting those quotas. Not in any category. In many categories, including milk, the U.S. isn't even at half of the zero tariff maximum. The International Dairy Foods Association, the lobbying group that represents American dairy producers, sent calculations to fact-checkers showing that at the end of last year, the average fill rate for dairy products was only 26.72%. In other words, American dairy exports to Canada face zero tariffs on 73% of potential volume that's not even being used. In practice, these tariffs are not actually paid by anyone, explained Al Mussel, an expert on Canadian agricultural trade. But Trump doesn't care about facts, he cares about rhetoric. So he kept raging about Canadian dairy tariffs, threatening reciprocal 250% tariffs, and using agriculture as a cudgel to beat Canada into submission. What Trump failed to understand, what he still doesn't understand, is that threatening food exports doesn't just hurt the target country. It forces them to find alternatives. And once they find those alternatives, they don't come back. Canada's $12 billion pivot. While Trump was threatening tariffs, Canadian agricultural strategists were doing the math. And the numbers were stark. 75% of Canadian food and beverage exports went to the United States. That dependence was a vulnerability Trump was exploiting. The solution wasn't to beg for mercy. The solution was to eliminate the vulnerability. Farm Credit Canada, a federal crown corporation, released a comprehensive analysis outlining a radical strategy. Shift $12 billion of Canadian food and beverage exports away from the U.S. market. Not over decades, over the next several years. The plan was sophisticated and multi-layered. First, increase interprovincial trade, getting Canadian provinces to buy more from each other instead of importing from the U.S. That could account for $2.6 billion of the shift. Second, leverage Canada's existing 15 free trade agreements more effectively. Canada had deals with 51 countries representing 66% of global GDP, but was still primarily selling to just one, the United States. Third, and most ambitiously, actively pursue new markets in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. This could create $9.4 billion in new business, replacing American markets with partnerships that treated Canada as an equal rather than a subordinate. The opportunities were enormous. Prepared foods represented $8.6 billion in exports, with 90% going to the U.S. Vegetable oils, animal feed, meat products, all heavily dependent on American buyers, all ripe for diversification. RBC economists estimated that if Canada pursued this strategy aggressively, the country's share of the global export pie could grow by 30% within a decade, adding $44 billion to total exports. But here's what made the strategy brilliant. It wasn't reactive. Canadian agricultural planners had been thinking about diversification for years. Trump's threats simply provided the political will and public support to actually execute it. The European opening. The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, had been in place since 2017, but Canadian agricultural exports to Europe had remained relatively modest. The infrastructure was there. The tariff elimination was there. What had been missing was the urgency. Trump provided that urgency. Within months of Trump's tariff threats, Canadian agricultural companies started aggressively pursuing European markets. CETA had already eliminated tariffs on 98% of Canadian goods entering the EU. Now, Canadian exporters were determined to use that access. A Quebec dairy farmer reported that his sales to European markets had increased by 34% as major grocery chains committed to featuring Canadian products. People are asking specifically for Canadian milk, Canadian cheese, he explained. The quality reputation is opening doors we couldn't get through before. Canadian beef exports to Europe surged. Pork products found new buyers in Germany and Poland. Seafood, particularly from Canada's Atlantic provinces, started flowing to markets in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. The timing was perfect. Russia's war on Ukraine had shattered Europe's east-west trade pipeline in agricultural commodities like potash, wheat, corn, and vegetable oil. The conflict had upended long-held assumptions about food security on the continent and forced many countries to seek new, reliable suppliers. Canada, with its reputation for quality, stability, and respect for trade rules, was exactly what Europe was looking for. And Canadian exporters, desperate to reduce dependence on the unpredictable American market, were eager to build these relationships. By the time Trump realized what was happening, Canadian agricultural companies had already signed multi-year supply contracts with European buyers. The infrastructure was being built. The relationships were solidifying. The pivot was becoming structural. The Asian gold mine. But Europe was only part of the story. The real opportunity, the market that would fundamentally transform Canadian agriculture, was Asia. Southeast and South Asia's global agriculture and food consumption is expected to grow to over 31% of global consumption within the next decade. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand. These are markets with growing populations, rising middle classes, and increasing demand for high-quality food products. Canadian agricultural strategists had been eyeing these markets for years, but American dependence had always made the investment seem unnecessary. Why build costly new supply chains to Asia when you could just truck products across the border to the US? Trump answered that question. Because your neighbor might weaponize food trade at any moment. Canada's Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, already provided preferential access to Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and 6 other Asia-Pacific nations representing over 500 million consumers. Canada was negotiating additional free trade agreements with ASEAN, India, and Indonesia. The infrastructure existed. What had been missing was the will to use it. Trump's threats provided that will. Canadian wheat exports to Indonesia increased dramatically. Peas and lentils found eager buyers in India. Canola, one of Canada's most important crops, started flowing to Asian markets that had previously been supplied by American competitors. The numbers were staggering. In just months after Trump's most aggressive tariff threats, Canadian agricultural exports to Asia jumped by double digits in multiple categories. A furniture company in Ontario that had struggled to compete with American imports suddenly had a 6-month backlog of orders from Asian buyers. And here's what made it permanent. These weren't speculative exports or one-time deals. These were long-term partnerships being built on the foundation of Canada's reputation for reliability, something America under Trump could no longer claim. The American farmer's silent catastrophe. While Canada was signing new deals and opening new markets, American farmers were watching their second-largest export market evaporate. Canada is the second-largest destination for U.S. agricultural products globally. Only Mexico buys more American farm goods. In a typical year, the U.S. exports $28 billion worth of agricultural products to Canada. Baked goods, fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, these are the top 3 categories. But through the first 7 months of this year, Agricultural exports to Canada were down 10%, and the decline was accelerating. American dairy farmers, the ones Trump claimed to be protecting, watched as Canadian buyers pivoted to European suppliers. The irony was cruel. Trump raged about Canadian tariffs that weren't actually being paid, and in response, Canada stopped buying American dairy altogether. American beef producers faced similar devastation. Canada had been a reliable buyer of U.S. beef for decades, with predictable demand and established relationships. As tensions escalated, Canadian meat packers started looking elsewhere. Brazilian beef, Australian beef, Argentine beef. Once those relationships were established, once the supply chains were built, American ranchers weren't getting those customers back. The lumber industry provided perhaps the clearest example of Trump's incompetence. Trump repeatedly claimed America could do without Canadian lumber, that America had an abundance of timber resources adequate to meet domestic needs. Industry experts warned this was delusional. America doesn't currently have the industrial capacity to meet demand, and placing tariffs on Canadian lumber would exacerbate the housing affordability crisis. But while Trump was threatening lumber tariffs, Canadian lumber companies were signing long-term supply agreements with Asian construction companies. China, Japan, South Korea all started buying Canadian lumber that had previously been destined for American markets. The agriculture sector's pain extended beyond direct exports. American farms that supplied restaurants and food processors in border regions saw orders drop as Canadian consumers boycotted American products. Manufacturers that produced goods for Canadian-frequented stores faced reduced demand. And then there were the input costs. Canada is America's largest supplier of potash, the key ingredient in fertilizer that American farmers depend on. When Trump threatened 25% tariffs on potash, he was literally threatening to increase costs for the very farmers he claimed to be protecting. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins eventually had to beg Trump to reduce potash tariffs from 25% to 10% at the height of planting season. The fact that this was even necessary showed how little thought in W had gone into the tariff strategy, the geopolitical weapon that backfired. Trump's fundamental error was treating food as just another commodity to be weaponized in trade negotiations. But food isn't like steel or automobiles. Food is about security. Food is about survival. When you threaten a nation's food supply, or their ability to export food, you force them to prioritize resilience over relationship. Canada learned this lesson, and they applied it ruthlessly. The Buy Canadian campaigns that swept the country weren't just about consumer products. They were about food security. Canadian grocery chains started prominently featuring domestic products. Government procurement policies prioritized Canadian suppliers. Marketing campaigns reminded Canadians that buying local food wasn't just patriotic, it was strategic. The psychological shift was complete. A poll found that 68% of Canadians were consciously avoiding American products, with that number climbing to 79% among Canadians under 40. This wasn't just anger. This was a generation deciding that food security couldn't depend on American reliability. Canadian farmers responded by expanding domestic production to meet this new demand. Fields that might have grown crops for export to the U.S. were now growing for the domestic market. Processing facilities that had relied on American buyers were retooling for Canadian and international customers. This is what economists call import substitution, replacing foreign goods with domestic production. It's usually slow and inefficient, but when driven by national security concerns and backed by genuine consumer demand, it happens fast, and it's permanent. Meanwhile, Canadian agricultural exports were finding eager buyers around the world who were specifically looking for alternatives to American suppliers. The Trump administration's unpredictability, its willingness to weaponize trade, its casual threats against allies, all of this made other countries nervous about depending on American food exports. Canada became the beneficiary. Made in Canada became a selling point not just for quality, but for reliability. Canadian exporters could tell buyers, "We won't threaten you with tariffs because our president is having a bad day. We honor our commitments. We're a stable partner." That message resonated, and it translated into billions of dollars in new business that American farmers were losing. The vulnerability America didn't know it had. Here's what Trump's food trade war exposed. American agriculture is far more vulnerable to disruption than anyone realized. For decades, American farmers had operated under the comfortable assumption that Canadian buyers needed them more than they needed Canadian buyers. The numbers seem to support this. America exported more agricultural products to Canada than Canada exported to America. But those